Hello, Professor Dudgeon's class. Welcome to Biblical Studies. My name is William Riley, and Hollis has asked me to guest lecture for her on the book of Judges, and so here we are doing that. Welcome to my office where I am recording this. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful day or night or morning. I am excited to talk to you a little bit about Judges, but first I just want to introduce myself so you know a little bit about who I am. I'm sad we are not meeting in person. But nonetheless, my name, like I said, is William Riley, and I came to Georgetown about 3 years ago-ish with my wife, Cecilia, who's pictured here. We love it here. We think it's beautiful. I love that there's 4 seasons. I'm originally from Texas, and so that's actually a big deal. She's from South Carolina, so she doesn't care. But we are very, very happy in Georgetown. We live with our 2 dogs, Moxie and Magnolia, who we love most days. It depends on if they've pooped in the house or not. But we don't have kids, we have dogs, and we love them. We are in Georgetown because I am the pastor of Faith Baptist Church in Georgetown right here. I'm about a mile from campus, and so this is my email address. In case after this you have any questions about our lecture, you can email me. Also, there's our website in case you're looking for a church and want to check us out. And no one ever knows where we are. And so I figured, while I have you here, I'd show you. This is where Faith Baptist Church is. We are not far from campus. So I'm currently sitting about a mile from wherever you are. We're just down 25, right across from the cemetery, really close to a delicious barbecue place, not owned by the same people. But yeah, it's a wonderful church, and we would love to see you on a Sunday morning or Wednesday night if you are looking for a family of faith to share God's love and a spirit of hope with. But nonetheless, that is not why we are here today. We are here to talk about warrior women in the book of Judges. Judges is one of the books of religious history. You've been studying about that section. It is a fascinating book with a lot of tales of intrigue and drama. But particularly today, I wanted to focus on some specific characters that are warrior women that we find in this book of Judges. I want to start at the top and say that there are other examples of women in the book of Judges we will not talk about today. The book of Judges is in no way extra kind to women. There are a lot of terrible, terrible things that happen to the women in the book of Judges. A lot of atrocities. This is just a sampling of a few of the characters. But I think there is a lot we can learn and glean from them as we go. So to start with, as we are considering these warrior women in the book of Judges, I want to start by just placing where we're at in the biblical story. And so I know you probably don't do exactly this in your class with this timeline, but I just wanted to get us an idea of this is kind of where all of this is taking place. So the book of Judges occurs between 1200 and 1000 BC. You can see it right here on this little timeline. And so at the very beginning of the story, we had the patriarchs. That means we had like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. You read about that in Genesis, this original covenant between God and God's people. And then we had the people go into Egypt. And so you have them trapped in Egypt as slaves, and then Moses comes and frees them through God. And so then you have the people wandering through the wilderness. That happens about 1250 BC. Then the next bit that is the beginning of the religious history part of the Bible is Joshua and conquest. So this is when the people of Israel, the generation after Moses, go through the promised land and conquer it for themselves and claim the land for themselves. And so the book of Judges happens just after that. It's that time period. They've just conquered the land. And so it's kind of, and now what? And that's what the book of Judges is it's the story of those tribes. It's important to note they have not become a united kingdom yet. If any of you are familiar with the biblical story, this is before King David or King Solomon. This is before the United Monarchy. So this is when there's still just kind of these groups of people hanging out in different areas. And so this is where we are situated. The whole religious history period that you're studying ends with the kingdoms falling apart down here. We are well before that. Kingdoms have not even established yet. But so yeah, 1200 to 1000, that's roughly where we are in our biblical story when we're talking about the book of Judges. some background information about what is going on in the world at this time. What's our historical criticism of this text? So some important things to know at this time period. This is a unique time in that there is no clear and dominant force in the area. So Egypt was the dominant ruling country for a long time. Egypt falls apart, and the Hittites were the dominant ruling country. But they have been overthrown, and so they are no longer in control. And eventually we'll see the Assyrians and the Babylonians come in and take control. But this is before that's happened. And so there's a lot of smaller countries trying to figure out what they're going to do. It's almost like, if any of you are historians, when the fall of the USSR happened and suddenly there's 30 different little countries all vying for power. Or after the fall of the Roman Empire, and then you have much of Europe separating into these little chunks. That's kind of the vibe. Is there's not this one overarching kingdom anymore, which is a unique thing in history. Also, specifically for the people of Israel, in their story, for the first time in their lives, they are transitioning from being a people who are nomadic to being people who live in cities. So up until this point, they've been wandering in the wilderness. They've been herds people, even in the time of Abraham, wandering around with their herds and their flocks, gathering. But this is a time where they're entering into a more civilized situation. They're building cities, they're building societies, they're building structures. For the first time in their lives, they're deciding this is what our community will look like in this context. As all of this is happening, they've entered into this new land. People are coming from across the Mediterranean Sea. You can see on the map here, this is the area we're talking about. People are coming from across the Mediterranean Sea. And so they're bumping up with a lot of different cultures and civilizations that they've never encountered before. It was kind of just Israel and whoever was ruling. Israel and Egypt. Israel and the Hittites. But now all of a sudden there's all these different cultures and religions and languages all just coming into contact with each other. And so for the people of Israel, it's a time of great development. They're developing societally and they're developing culturally. They're learning new things. They're hearing about new cultures and customs and practices. They're experimenting with some new stuff, good and bad. And so there's just a lot going on with the people of Israel, all while they are jostling for geopolitical power with all these other groups. So there's a lot happening in the world around them. Just as a side historical note, because I'm a nerd and I care about this kind of stuff, this picture right here of this giant tablet that you see, this is called the Mernafta Stele. This is an Egyptian tablet from about 1200 BC was when it was originally chiseled. And the big deal about this, why this is up, is this is from this time period. This is right around the time this Judges stuff is going on. But it is the oldest written account we have of someone called the people of Israel. And so in this document, it's like way down here. It's like, I can't read it to you. I don't read Egyptian hieroglyphics at all, or from 1200 BC. But there's these little hieroglyphics that say something about the people of Israel. And it describes them as this nomadic people group. And in this tablet, it talks about how Egypt has completely destroyed them and wiped them off the face of the earth. But that's what Egyptians, they talk about destroying people all the time in tablets. That wasn't a real thing. But I just point that out to say, not only do we have a lot going on within the Bible with the people of Israel, but this is where we're starting to also see outside of Bible evidence about the people of Israel and what is going on in their world. So we're starting to see other cultures talk about this group of people, which is just a really interesting thing to have. So that's kind of the time frame. That's what's going on. That's the context around all of this. And so again, before we start actually talking about our text for today, one other thing we need to talk about is, what are judges? What is a judge? This is an important thing for us to consider before we begin, because the book of Judges is named after this concept, and because we're going to be dealing with this concept a lot today. So when you think of judge, what do you think of? The first thing that I think of is I think of the dudes with the powder white wigs. I can't help it. Like these guys. It's just what comes to mind. Or I'll think of Judge Judy. we have a lot of different connotations of what a judge is. A lot of it influenced by our current modern context of, we think like Supreme Court justice, we think judge in a courtroom. At this time, that is not an unhelpful way to think about judges, but at this time, the judge was a little bit different. So when we say a judge, this is what we mean. I'm going to not read these. We're going to have several passages like this. I'm going to not read this out loud to you on this recording because I think you would just get monotonously tired of my voice. But this text is Judges 2:16 through 19. Oh, here, let me move myself out of the way so you can read it. This text is Judges 2:16 through 19. And I would encourage you, just go ahead and pause the video for a second and read this text. Okay, so I'll move myself back now. Thank you. So this text sets up the idea of what a judge is. So what are judges? Judges, it comes from the Hebrew root safat. Safat means to govern or judge. Simple enough. Some key components of a judge. They were appointed by God in a specific time for a specific need. It's important to know they weren't elected. It wasn't like my dad was a judge, so I'm a judge. That was not the system. The system was God appoints this specific person at this specific time for this specific reason. Not just because, but because this thing is happening. All right, and appointed by God is a very key thing. The judge was seen as the civic, military, and spiritual leader of the tribe, of the tribes, of the group of the people of Israel. This looked different with each different judge, but there was always some sort of military thing involved. Judges were going to war. They were fighting. One of the judges, there's a story of him sneaking into a king's bedchamber and stabbing him with a knife. And the guards thought that the king had just pooped himself because he did that, apparently. So they didn't find him till the next day. It's a whole thing. Judges looked a little different, but they were always seen as these military leaders. They were doing these military things, but also as these civic leaders. People would come to them for advice. People would come to them, kind of like we think of judges now. People would come to them and have disputes, and the judge would help settle it. But also, judges were spiritual leaders. One of the judges we're going to talk about today is described as a prophet. They were seen as having a special connection with God. They were appointed directly by God. And so a lot of what they did was on behalf of God. And so they were seen, it wasn't just, I'm a judge on a bench. It was almost like they were every branch of government. They were the president, they were the 5-star general, they were the Supreme Court justice, and they were the super pastor. Judges were really important leaders at the time. It's a key thing about judges is when judges did it right, which most of them did, they carried out God's desires, not their own. So God appoints them for a specific reason, and then they went about fulfilling that will of God. So it wasn't like the judge comes in power and then's like, everybody gets a free Slurpee, that's my agenda. It was whatever God had directed them to do. They were the one who carried that out. So very much working on behalf of God. And that's an important thing to distinguish because then God got all the glory and God was like the uniting factor. The people came together because of God, not because of the judge. It wasn't like, oh, we all love this specific judge. It was no, we all worship God. And so we're going to come together under that banner. One other note on the context of all of this, I've really portrayed this idea of this leader amongst the people, and that's true. But it's also important to know at this time, the people was not a very connected, cohesive group. They weren't a country yet. They were a bunch of loosely connected tribes. So the people of Israel did not have a standing army. They didn't have one centralized form of government. They didn't have exact, perfect rules of law. They were these different groups that were loosely connected under the banner of God. They were worshipers of Yahweh that would come together through the leadership of this special judge. And so I'm sure that was just a nightmare. I have this picture of George Washington here. By the way, spoilers, that's George Washington. I have this picture of George Washington here because it kind of reminds me of that. again, for our little history nerds in there, if you were alive back in the 1700s, you would know that the United States, even after it became a country, was still this like loosely affiliated group of states. It was more about the individual state than about the actual federal government, right? You have all these different groups. And even at the time of the Revolution, there wasn't like the United States Army. There were all these different militias coming together. And George Washington was seen as this great military and civic leader. The religious part, separation of church and state, but he was more than just a general, and he was more than just a president. He was like this leader figure. So it kind of reminds me of our founding fathers in that sense of bringing together these loosely affiliated people for the sake of freedom, escaping tyranny, not paying taxes on our tea, whatever the thing was, this uniting cause. So that's roughly what a judge is. We see these judges happening throughout the book. The book of Judges is the stories of these figures. There's several of them throughout the story. Because what would happen throughout the history of Israel is the people would stray from God. They would do bad things. They would fall into this state of disobedience. Oftentimes that meant they were either worshiping other gods or they were not caring about poor people. Those are normally the two issues. You've started worshiping these other cultures' gods, or you're not taking care of poor people or migrants or the people that are struggling within your borders. And so God gets frustrated with the people, and God says, this isn't going to work. I'm going to call a judge. And so the judge comes in, overthrows the other group of people if they're like being oppressed by a group. A lot of times that's what would happen. They're worshiping these other gods, and then another country comes in and starts taking over. And so they would overthrow them. They would give them their independence back. They would destroy all the idols. They would reset the worship. They would make everything good again. And then that judge would die. And there is no line of succession here. So there just wouldn't be a judge. Everything's whatever. And then slowly the people fall back into this state of disobedience. And so that was kind of the pattern. The people disobey. God sends a judge. The judge fixes everything. The judge dies. The people disobey. God sends a judge. Like, it's just that over and over. Honestly, not a great system. Kind of not surprising they ended up wanting a monarchy, but I digress. So that is what a judge was. We've kind of done all the background that you need before we start looking at these specific characters. But so the first character we're going to look at is a judge for the people of Israel. And so we're going to look at the judge, Deborah. Again, I would encourage you, just pause this and read this for a second. I'm not going to read it out loud to you via this recording. So just go ahead and pause the video, read Judges 4 through 9. Okay, so just briefly to summarize what this story is. So Deborah is this figure. She's described as a prophetess, as a judge of the people of Israel. Literally, a judge. There's no debate. Deborah was a judge. Deborah was a prophetess. Period. So she is the civic, the military, the religious leader of the people of Israel. She has been called by God to this specific purpose. Period. Already, maybe we kind of see where we're going here. But so it talks about how Deborah would sit under a tree and the people would come to her for wisdom, for judgment, when they had disagreements and stuff. And so one day, the backstory of this story is there's this other army that has come in, and this other group of people have come in, and they have kind of taken over some land, and they have started treating the people really, really poorly. They are enslaving people. They are pillaging villages. They are murdering people, just doing terrible atrocities. And so Jabin is the guy who's coming in and doing this, and his main general is this guy named Sisera. And so Jabin and Sisera are the two bad people. And so Deborah, as the judge, as the military, civic, and religious leader, Deborah's let's do something about this. And so she calls Barak, who is another military leader, another person in their group, and she says, we're going to go beat Jabin's army. We're going to save the people of Israel. And he's whoa, I'll only go if you go because you're the judge. And she's that's fine. And then she ends with this thing of, but don't worry, because the general is going to be the general will die in the hands of a woman. This big emphasis on like, you're not going to kill him, Barack, a woman is. And everyone thinks, oh, it's Deborah. We'll get there. But so they go and they fight this general on behalf of the people of Israel. And they win. They do an incredible job. There's this great story about they come in and they wipe this army out and the people are on the run. And so this first warrior woman that I want us to take a second with is Deborah. Again, described as prophet, described as judge. She is the leader of the people of Israel. And she is willing to take on this bold and audacious task of fighting off this invading army. She's got some military cunning. You'll see in a minute. She devises a good strategy on how to do it. She is just seen as this wise leader. And as far as we know, was respected by the people because it doesn't tell us anything else. So it's our first character, is the character of Deborah. And again, her story starts in Judges 4. And so if you have not read the text on the screen, I would encourage you to do so now. So this story of Deborah, she actually, this story leads into our second story. And so she leads this army with Barak, and they do this battle, and they win, and they defeat the enemies. But the general, the evil general Sisera, he runs away. He escapes the battle. And so he is fleeing for his life. He's on his own at this point. He's fleeing for his life. The victory's already been won. God's desire for Israel to be freed has already happened. But Sisera is running away, and so he encounters our second warrior woman, Jael. Jael, Jael. And so Judges 4 continues now and picks up with Jael. And so again, I would encourage you, pause for a second and read this text, Judges 4:17 through 22. So our story continues. You have Sisera is running. He runs into this camp of an entire other group. Jael is not an Israelite. She's a totally different people group. So you have Deborah representing Israel, the people of God. Sisera representing this foreign army who's invaded. And then you have this third group, a Kenite, who is this entirely other group of people, and they actually have a treaty with Sisera's people. So they're not fighting Israel right now, but they're friends with Sisera, the evil general. And so he runs into this camp where he's pretty sure, okay, these are my people. I'm going to be able to find some refuge. And so he runs in, and Jael comes out to meet him. She says, hey, essentially, what are you doing? And she says, hey, don't worry about it. Come on. Come into my tent. You'll be safe here. And so she brings him into her tent, and it says she covers him with a rug. She gets him nice and cozy. And he says, hey, could you give me some water? I'm real thirsty. I've been running all day. And so it says she opens a skin of milk and gave him a drink of milk, and she covered him up. And he said to her, stand at the entrance of the tent, and if anybody comes and asks you, is anyone here, say no. All right. So he is completely lulled into this safe, secure space. Jael's like, hey, come here, bud. You know, she's like patting him on the back. It's going to be okay. She gives him a warm little blanket, a little cup of milk. She's putting him to bed, tucking him in. She is just lulling him into this sense of calm and security. And he has no reason to think that there's any threats here because, again, these people have an alliance with him. And so he rests, he goes to sleep. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of almost motherly or wife-like imagery going on here where, you know, she's giving him some milk. She's tucking him in. There's a lot of just kind of caregiver vibes happening. Invites him into the tent, which would be a very scandalous thing for the time. She is taking a huge risk inviting a stranger into her tent. But I digress. And so he says hey, be a lookout for me. I completely trust you. It says, but she took a tent peg, just a thing that you keep the tent in the ground, took a tent peg, took a hammer, went over to him, and drove the peg into his temple till it went down into the ground. And so literally all the way through his head. He was lying fast asleep and he died. All right, so this is that scene of JL. This woman is there offering this refuge, and then as soon as he falls asleep, she drives a tent peg through his head. She murders him. And then Barak comes. Barak is the general from Israel. He comes in pursuit of Sisera. And again, she comes out to meet him. And she said, hey, I'm going to show you who you're looking for. And so he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with a tent peg to his temple. And so there's a lot happening in this story with Deborah and with Jael. And ultimately, like Deborah said at the end of Deborah's thing, when she said, he will be delivered into the hands of a woman. Ultimately, we find out that woman is Jael. Not just any woman, but a common foreign woman. So a lot is happening in this story with these warrior women. We have this leader figure, and we also have this like cunning trickster type figure. And it's important to note there's a lot of political dynamics happening here where Jael has probably just secured an alliance with Barak now. Sisera's army's done. He is no longer a useful political alliance, but Barak is. And so she has also taken into her own hands. She has, for her people, created this space of peace as well by doing this, which is a fascinating thing in itself. So that is our second warrior woman. These are 2 of 3 women who are actually named by name in the book of Judges. The third one is Delilah, which is a warrior in her own right, but we don't have time to cover her. But they are both named. We have Deborah, we have Jael. No other woman in Judges is given a name. So our third warrior woman, we just have a certain woman. And so again, I invite you, pause a second and read Judges 9:50 through 56 to get a picture of a certain woman. So this story is about, this is now several years later. This is well after Deborah. This is specifically 5 chapters after Deborah. But the setup for this is there is this guy that gets called to be a judge. After Deborah, he gets called to be a judge. Everything's going great. When he dies, his son is like, hey, maybe instead of this whole judges just popping in and out thing, maybe let's do this kind of like a monarchy, and I will just become the next judge. Again, that's not the system that was set up originally, but he says, maybe I will just be the next judge. And so this guy named Abimelech, he has 70 brothers. So there's a lot of options here. And so he gets all 70 of his brothers together, and then he kills them all. It's essentially a red wedding from Game of Thrones. Gets them all in the same room and then just kills them all. And so he claims this role of, I am now the judge of the people. He was not appointed by God. He was not appointed for a specific reason. He is just claiming this for himself. It doesn't go well. And so then he starts going around solidifying power by just like taking out these different tribal leaders. And so this story in Judges 9 is the end of Abimelech's story. And so just so you know, right before this story, he went into a town and got all the people trapped in a tower and burnt the tower. He set the tower on fire, and it says he killed 1,000 men and women who were trapped inside the tower. All right, so that's happened right before this, is this guy just killed 1,000 innocent people by burning them alive inside of a tower. You know, everyday Hebrew Bible stuff. So now here's where this story picks up with a certain woman. And so the story is Abimelech, the bad guy. He rolls into this city. They just burnt this tower down. He rolls into this city, and because that's the thing, is like you go to the tower because it's the tallest, safest place. And so then from the tower, you can shoot arrows down. You can throw stuff down. It's like your place of safety. So he rolls into the city, and all the people run into the towers and shut themselves in. And so they're all at the top of the tower. They're all hanging out at the top. And he comes near so that he can burn it with fire like he just did. We've just seen this play out. But this time, it says a certain woman threw an upper millstone, which is it's a thing that you would use to grind grain to turn it into flour. So it's a cooking device, which in itself is a an insult to men because it's not like a weapon of war. It's a woman's thing, and like for some reason that would be humiliating even more to them. But so throws it over and crushes Abimelech's head, killing him. Immediately, it says, he called to the young man who carried his armor and said, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that people will not say about me, 'A certain woman killed me.'" So the young man thrust him through, and he died. When the Israelites saw that he was dead, they all went home. Thus, God repaid Abimelech for the crime committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. My favorite part of the story is the fact that he's really concerned with, I want to make sure that people don't say a woman killed me. And now, 3,000 years later, we're talking about how a woman killed him. I love the irony of that. But nonetheless, this is the story of this certain woman who, facing the destruction of everyone she knows, takes matters into her own hands, grabs this millstone, throws it on his head, and kills him. And importantly, the last line, and thus God repaid. God repaid. It is interpreted within the scriptures that this act that she did was the will of God. It was an act of God for this woman to throw this millstone on this guy's head. That's an important note for us to not miss. Is God's judgment happened because this woman with this millstone. All right, so those are our three characters. We have Deborah, the judge prophet. We have Jael, the foreigner, and tent peg driver. And then we have a certain woman, the millstone thrower. These three women I would call warrior women in the book of Judges. And so my question is, how would we describe them? What adjectives would you use to describe these women? What characteristics would you use to describe these women? Do these women remind you of anyone that you know or know from history? I mean, hopefully you don't know anyone who's driven a tent peg through someone's skull, but other aspects. How would you describe these women? Normally, this would be the point where you would tell me out loud. We can't do that. And so I have offered some characteristics that I would say describe these women. Some of them, if not all of them, are leaders. Deborah is literally the leader of the people. They're brave. They're brave because they're willing to do things that no one else seems able to do. The woman throwing the stone down, she's willing to take matters into her own hands and look over and throw something down when everyone else is cowering. Jael is willing to invite someone into her tent that could easily overpower her and kill her, and then try to kill him and be successful. Literally, these women are carrying out God's plan. We saw that with the certain woman, but we see it with all three of them. Deborah, as a judge, is acting out God's plan. Jael is making Deborah's prophecy come to reality. All three of these women are carrying out God's dream for the world. I would say we could call these women strong. We can call them independent. We can even call them cunning. They're tricksters. They, especially Jael, you see this in her, kind of taking matters into your own hands, being a little tricky. This idea of this cunning approach. I am always one step ahead. I'm in control of the situation. There are probably also some other characteristics we could come up with and that you have come up with. But these are some of the characteristics that come to mind, and most notably, some of the positive characteristics that come to mind. I draw that out, and I want to point that out because it's intriguing, because these characteristics and these stories sometimes are counter to the things we hear our churches or our friends or our religious leaders saying about women. What have you heard churches say about women? I know not all of them. I would hope our church does not say some of these things. But you always hear about churches saying, well, a woman can't preach. A woman cannot be the head of the household. The woman cannot be leadership. A woman's place is in the home. A woman should only speak when being spoken to. You hear all of these sorts of things through this religious context, and it's always because the Bible tells me so. It's always because, well, in 2 Corinthians it says a woman should cover her head, and in 2 Timothy it says a woman should not speak in church. And so it's just curious to me. Some of these things we've heard said about women in church seem to be very counter to these also biblical examples of women. It's a curious thing to me, and I'm curious what is going on. One quote I want to highlight from Robert Alter. He's a rabbi. He's great. I enjoy him. Before we move on, specifically, he's talking about the JL story that we just read. He says, it's noteworthy that in this book based on male warrior culture, first JL, and now this anonymous woman of Thebes, delivers death blows to an enemy. In a more seductive feminine mode, Delilah will bring down the Israelite hero Samson. Pointing out this idea that Judges is not a feminist manifesto. Judges is by no means this radical new perspective on female. But even in this male warrior culture based book, you have these stories of women as heroes, of women as warriors, of women as the answer that God is looking for, women as able to do things that men cannot. Even in a negative context, women as able to take down the Israelite hero, Samson, that no one else can. And so you get this mixed perspective of even at the time, women literally were seen as property. So even at the time when women were seen as property, in a book that does not favorably treat women, there's still these examples. And it's curious, what do we do with that? Another quote to highlight. This is from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was an not abolitionist. She was a suffragette in the early 1900s. She was fighting for the right of women to vote. And she said, "We never hear sermons pointing women to the heroic virtues of Deborah as worthy of their imitation. Nothing is said in the pulpit to rouse them from the apathy of ages, to inspire them to do and dare great things, to intellectual and spiritual achievements, in real communion with the great spirit of the universe." It is curious that we don't hear a lot of perspective from that. And again, not every church is that way. If you come to faith, you hear a lot of sermons about women in the Bible. That's why I'm giving this lecture right now. But it is curious that our churches for a long time have seemed to focus on some parts of the Bible without focusing on others. They talk about how Paul says a woman should not speak in church. Don't talk about how Paul also says when a woman speaks, they should. Clearly, there's two different things going on. They talk about how Timothy says a woman cannot be a leader. They don't talk about how God called Deborah to be a leader. They talk about how women were not disciples. Don't talk about all of the women by name named in the epistles as people traveling with Paul teaching about the Gospels. So we get these mixed messages throughout the Bible of, yeah, it says some things about the role of women. It also says some things about the roles of other people. The tricky thing is we're only lifting up one part and not the other. And hopefully that's part of what you're doing in this class is you're learning the biblical text is more complicated than I thought. It's not just me pulling out this one verse to prove this one argument. It's a story of God with God's people over several thousands of years in several different contexts. And so how do I approach that? What do I do with the fact that Deborah was clearly called to be a judge? That a certain woman was clearly the person living out God's will And also, there are texts talking about women's roles in the church as not being as great. How do we handle those contrasts is one of the big questions that you're hopefully wrestling with this semester, because this is not the only question. There's lots of questions, even just from the book of Judges. You have questions about, all right, God says love everyone. God says turn the other cheek. Jesus says turn the other cheek. And also, in the book of Judges, God encourages and ordains the murder of several thousands of people because they're not Jewish or because whatever. It can be a complex, confusing idea, this issue of what do we do when we start looking at the entire Bible. But I think that's also how we show respect for the Bible. If I don't listen to it, if I don't listen to all of it, if I don't pay attention to the Deborahs and the Jaels, I'm not actually taking it seriously. And quite frankly, wrestling with these questions, like, welcome to the rest of your life. You're always going to be asking these questions and learning new things. And so hopefully this class with Professor Dudgeon, you're able to wrestle through some of these questions more. And I would encourage you, as you come across issues like this, reach out to her. She's a very wise person with very wise counsel, who can share resources and ideas and thoughts with you. Get involved in a church that's asking these questions. You can, specifically about this lecture, you can email me. I'll go back in a second so you can have my email again, or you could just rewind the video, I guess. But yeah, take these questions seriously, but don't use them as the excuse of, so this is how things are. I'm going to write off half of my class because of their gender, because this one verse, this one place. Remember that it's more complex than that. Hopefully that is what this story examines. So today you've learned a little bit about the book of Judges. You've learned a little bit about what a judge was, a little Israelite history, and maybe you've gained a new perspective on what the Bible says about the role of women in ministry and as leaders throughout the text. Thank you so much for your listening. And again, I would encourage you, email me if you have any questions, or let Hollis know, because like I said, Hollis is beyond wise in this and several other regards. But that's all I got. Thank y'all so much, and I will maybe see you in person sometime. Bye.